Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Welcome back. Today, I'm interviewing Trevor Burrus. This is Trevor's second time on my podcast, and I'm really excited. Trevor is the host of Free Thoughts, along with Aaron Powell, and he is a research fellow at Cato Institute and the editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review, which is really cool. It's my great pleasure to have him on today, and I'm really excited because we're going to be talking about guns. And last time we talked about the war on drugs. Very heavy topics, but he has so much to say and it's so interesting. So here we go. Welcome back.
Oh, thank you so much. I love being on this show. It's great.
So first, I wanted to ask you something that, of course, I've already asked you once before, but I ask all my guests. What is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
I thought about this one because I did have an answer before, but I think that one struck me, something I've been thinking a lot about more recently, and it's not really a sort of philosophical or even policy point, but I think it's a very good thing to realize the younger you are, the younger you can realize how much fear and shame can control your life, especially fear. Like a lot of things that people don't do, they don't try out for the team or try out for the musical or ask this guy or girl out or do something because they're afraid. And so a lot of opportunities are missed and lost. And I think that as you get older, you look back and you realize, well, why was I afraid of this? Why didn't I just do this? So my general life lesson for people your age, Juliet, is to think about how fear operates in your life, and it's always worth overcoming it.
I think that's such a good response. And honestly, the answers I love the most of the responses to that question are the ones that are more general and kind of just about life. And so I definitely will think about that more. And I hope the people my age will think about that more. I hope adults will think about that more because I think it's really important. And I don't know, I've been reflecting on fear a lot recently, actually. So it's kind of relevant to my life right now.
Always.
So, okay, my first question is, how many guns and how many gun owners do we have in the United States?
That's a good first question. The most simple answer is we don't know exactly. The numbers are usually between 300 million and 400 million that people kind of guess on. But this is one issue with trying to quote unquote solve, and I make that very specific, quote unquote, solve the gun problem in America, because we have to define what the gun problem is and where that problem can't be fixed, and we can get into that. But people try to create databases to estimate how many guns are owned, because think about how guns move around in the United States. So, maybe someone's grandpa died and he had 5 guns that, of course, were not registered, and no one knew that he had these guns any more than they know how many TVs you have. And guns are very durable goods. So you can have a gun that's 50 years old or 100 years old that still works. And so then those guns get passed down to someone else. And so now these 5 guns go to the grandson or something. And so guns get moved around like that. And because there's no gun registry, and actually by law, there is no gun registry in the United States, we have to guess. And we guess with various proxies. Probably the most common one is to use the percentage of suicides by guns as a proxy to try and figure out how many guns there are. And now your second question was gun owners. How many gun owners? Well, this is not equally distributed, right? So fewer than 50% of households own guns. And guns are like anything else, any other good. That 20% of people, not any other good, but most goods, the 80-20 rule applies. So 20% of people own probably 80% of the guns. And people might be like, oh, those are the crazy people. Well, no, they're like the gun collectors. I mean, Juliet, I own a lot of guitars, right? The guitars would have the same kind of function. Like 20% of the people own 80% of the guitars. And people come to me and say, Trevor, why do you have 13 guitars? How could you ever possibly like play 13 guitars? And similarly speaking, people who have guns tend to, if they're collecting, if they like historical guns, if they're doing gunsmith activities, they might have a fair amount of guns. And a lot of anti-gun people regard that as somewhat suspicious activity, but really it's just people who enjoy guns as a hobby. So the short answer to your question is we don't know, but it's probably between 3 and 400 million.
That guitar point is really, I don't know, it's really helpful because even when talking about this, and even though I've kind of been reading up a lot about this sort of stuff, and I've tried to understand really, I've never been a gun fanatic myself, but I kind of am a guitar fanatic. So I understand more the having 13 guitars, and it's not that you need them, but you want them because they're all different and they all have different purposes and they're all beautiful. So I can see that.
And people feel that way about gun. I mean, so friends of mine, I mean, I'm not a huge gun owner, but I like historical guns. So I have some World War I guns and I have some World War II guns. Some friends of mine are they are into guns like I'm into guitars. So they repair them. They get guns from, Italian guns from the 1880s and make them work correctly. And they're fascinated by the mechanisms and how the gun works and how this gun designer used this way of making the gun fire and this gun designer used this way. That's what most of these people are who own a lot of guns.
And I can see how it would be interesting. I'm also don't have time for many hobbies, but it is something that I am interested in just generally because it's something that people create and it's kind of art in this other way. Well, I mean, it's like guitars. Everything goes back to guitars. So to continue setting the stage for a further policy conversation and kind of moving to that part of the conversation, how many types of guns are they? What are the different types of guns that exist?
This is a good question too, because it's a very important point for understanding the gun debate. Probably one of the biggest issues in the gun debate is that the gun debate in the United States is not really a policy debate as much as it's a culture debate. So there's a group of people out there, many of them living in red states, but not necessarily. They might be living in the rural parts of blue states. And they grew up with guns. The guns are very normal to them. They understand guns. The words like, semi-automatic, automatic, rifle, pistol, magazine, clip, these words mean something to them. And then there are other people, mostly urban people living in blue states who maybe have never even been around guns in their entire life. And if they were around a gun, they would feel very uneasy. Like I call this gun disgust, where their reaction to guns is disgust. It's very akin to, say, your reaction to like a rotting corpse or something, or a rotting piece of meat, that their reaction to it is disgust. And if you said, hey, look, here's a gun, and you held it out to them, they would kind of jump back like it's a coiled snake or something. And it's very hard to do good policy when you have these people who feel disgusted toward guns. And you see that manifesting in a lot of different areas. So there's a lot of zero tolerance kind of policies that you see in school where, you do not allow kids to use their fingers like little pointy guns. And there's one famous story maybe 10 years ago where a kid chewed a Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun and he got suspended. And a lot of this is designed to engender disgust toward guns. And it's just not I can sympathize with that. I know some people don't like them and I can completely sympathize with that, but it's not a good position to hold when making public policy. So to go to your question, because of that culture dichotomy in the United States, many of the people who are trying to regulate guns have no idea about guns, to the point of comedy. And when they try to say we're going to ban these guns with these characteristics, people who understand guns laugh in their faces because they have no idea what they're talking about. To give you an example, so going more directly to your question, there are let's talk about two different types of guns for the mechanism of how the gun works. Right? One, so you have semi-automatic. We'll talk about three. Okay. So you have a semi-automatic firing mechanism. Now, this could be on a pistol, this could be on a rifle, it could be on a mounted gun, like on a Jeep or something. A semi-automatic firing mechanism can be called a self-loader. So if you think about old Westerns with that revolver, right? So you have the revolver with the little wheel with the bullets in it, and then that hammer that goes back and forth. Well, sometimes you would have to cock that hammer, and you would not be able to shoot the round until you manually cocked the hammer back, shot the round, and then you'd have to manually cock the hammer back to shoot the next round. So that gun is not semi-automatic in the sense, although revolvers are a little bit different. It requires an intervening action. If you have to do a cocking mechanism, an intervening action in between shots, then it's not a semi-automatic weapon. A semi-automatic weapon means that you pull the trigger and then you can pull the trigger again and it will fire until it runs out of ammunition. That's a very important distinction. And then the next one is automatic weapons. So an automatic weapon, more commonly known as a machine gun, is one where you can hold down the trigger and it will spray bullets until it runs out of ammunition. You see them in war movies. Those weapons have been highly regulated since 1934. And although there are automatic weapons out in public hands, they're very, very rare. They're very, very expensive, and they're never used in crime. Nevertheless, going back to the idea of gun ignorance, you still hear politicians, including, for example, Barack Obama, after the Newtown tragedy, saying that using in that tragedy, the killer used an automatic weapon, which was just manifestly false. So one thing we have to be clear on if we're going to do smart gun policy is we have to have some understanding of what guns do, how they work. And so then when someone comes in and says, these guns were meant to fire, 20 bullets a second. You hear people say stuff like this all the time. We can say that this is just wrong. These things do not do that. A semi-automatic rifle fires as fast as you can pull the trigger. Hunting rifles are semi-automatic rifles. They can be, and so can so-called assault weapons, which we can get into what that category is too.
Yeah, so that's what I was about to ask, because I noticed that in classifying different types of guns, you didn't mention assault weapons. So why did you not mention assault weapons?
So assault weapon is not a real category of gun. It was actually a category that was invented by the anti-gun lobby kind of in the late 80s to pursue a type of gun that they thought they could get the public to agree should be banned. So it's mostly a rhetorical strategy. In 1990, so these are guns that look kind of scary. They look more like military guns, but in functionality, they may not be different at all from a hunting rifle. So I can give you an example, and I can't hold up show and tell, but so one of the guns that I own is called an M1 Garand, which is the standard issue gun that the World War II soldiers that my grandfather used in World War II, for example. The M1 Garand is a literal weapon of war. It looks like a hunting rifle. It's a long wooden rifle. It is semi-automatic. It fires 8 rounds out of a clip. Now that gun would not be classified as an assault weapon under any law that I've seen classifying assault weapons. What the assault weapons kind of categorization did, in 1994, there was an assault weapons ban, a federal assault weapons ban that was passed. And it said it had to be a semi-automatic rifle. So that, as we discussed before, it had to be a gun that shoots when you depress the trigger without an intervening cocking action. And then if it had 2 of 5 characteristics, then it would be classified as an assault weapon. And these characteristics were essentially entirely cosmetic. So one of them was, for example, a collapsible or an extendable stock. So sometimes you can the part of the gun that you put into your shoulder, if you're a shorter person, you can make it shorter so it's not such a long gun. Or if it's a taller person shoots it, you can extend it out. So it's kind of variable. Another one was a forward pistol grip on the actual rifle. So where the trigger is, if there's a pistol grip there. Another one is a thing called a barrel shroud, which is just a thing that goes over the barrel that has holes in it. Now, some of these characteristics, they affect how the gun fires to some extent for personal preferences. Like if you have a collapsible stock, then it's good for people who have different heights. A pistol grip might be something you'd prefer just for stability. Barrel shrouds can lower the temperature of the barrel, but it's all very, very marginal. It's all very, very small effects. They do not increase the lethality of the gun. The other factor here is the question of magazine size. And the magazine size is not a function of the gun unless there's a magazine built into the gun. So if you have a removable box magazine, that can be anywhere from, say, 10 rounds to 50 rounds. But the actual way that it connects to the gun, or even 100 rounds, or some comically oversized ones, the actual place where it connects to the gun is the same. So it's like it's a box that just varies in length, but you cannot, there's no such thing as like a gun that uniquely holds a bunch of ammunition if it doesn't have an internal magazine. It can just take a bigger magazine if you want to put it in there, or it could take a smaller magazine. So the short answer, Juliet, is there is really no such thing as an assault weapon that any person who understands gun would recognize. And secondly, even if I take that category of assault weapons as defined in these statutes, they are almost never used in any crime ever in this country. Like probably about 300 people a year, we don't have data for now, are killed with rifles in this country, 300 to 400. And assault weapons would be a subset of that. And so we have them used in very high profile shootings, but they're almost never used in the actual gun homicide rate that we look at in this country. They are arguably the safest owned guns in the country. The AR-15 is the most popular rifle in the country, and almost no one is ever killed with an AR-15. So in some way, it's one of the safest owned guns in the country, which makes sense if you understand the way gun violence actually occurs.
And just thinking about the term assault weapon, I feel like any weapon could be an assault weapon, because if it's a weapon and it's used for violence, you're going to be violently assaulting someone. So I don't know. I guess it makes sense to me because I've grown up in this time of gun control march and gun control this and gun control that, but it really doesn't make sense as a phrase, because any weapon could really be an assault. I don't know. I feel like
that's an important point. No, you're completely correct that it is wrong. And we get into, we can get into what I think kind of gun control, where we should focus if we're going to talk about it, like what kind of gun control works. But like the first thing you should do if you want to seriously address the problems that we have with guns is to kind of do away with the idea of uniquely bad guns, which the gun control crowd tend to be obsessed with. So like there are some guns that are only designed for murder or something like this, or these guns only spray death. As I said, that's that my World War II rifle, that is a literal weapon of war, will shoot as fast as I can pull the trigger, up to 8 rounds. Well, not quite as fast as I can pull the trigger. There's a variance here. The technical variance is that a gun will shoot as fast as the recoil as you can put it back on target. So what that means is if you've ever shot a gun, like when you shoot a pistol and like your hand inevitably goes back. And so in the time that you have to bring the gun back down and put it back on target, that's the effective limit of the firing rate of a gun. And so there aren't these guns that spray death and that are uniquely violent and uniquely dangerous. And so we should really focus on the kind of guns that people are actually doing crime and mayhem with, and not these sort of guns that scared Dianne Feinstein.
What are the main reasons that people say they own guns?
Oh, self-defense is by far, especially this year, right? We've seen a very interesting thing happen this year with a level of gun purchasing that has never really been seen since we've kind of tracked via the background check system that we have. Self-defense is the number one reason, but sporting and hunting and just fun, right? This is another thing about guns. Like shooting is fun. Like I like going shooting. I like going shooting with historically interesting weapons. Like that's one of the main reasons I own guns, which is why I own pretty much historical weapons. But you more and more when you look at survey data, and I said especially this year, self-defense is the number one reason, and guns are good for self-defense. I mean, this is the rub of the whole thing, Juliet. You mentioned all guns can be assault weapons. The thing about a gun is that it has this characteristic. The characteristic is it projects force over a distance. Like a well-functioning gun, no matter what the caliber or the size of the bullet is, it projects force over a distance. The ability to project force over a distance means that it is uniquely good for committing crime, true, but it also, the same characteristic makes it good for protecting yourself. And that's the vicious trade-off where you say, oh, this gun is really only good for crime. Well, it's like, no, the guns that are good for crime and the guns that are good for defending yourself are like often kind of the same guns to some extent. I mean, depending on how you're carrying a gun, if you are carrying a gun in size and stuff like that, but like the characteristic, the reason a gun is good for self-defense. I mean, think about yourself as a woman. And I gave you a knife and I said, all right, here you go. There's your self-defense. Walk through Anacostia, at 2 a.m. with a knife. Whereas the gun gives you the ability to project force over a distance and actually scare someone just by showing them the gun. So it's the same, you think about the robber who commits the robbery by putting their finger in their pocket or saying that they have a gun. That can be effective enough to commit a robbery, but it's also very effective for self-defense if you just brandish a gun. Almost every time that people use a gun in self-defense, they just show it. And that's a good thing. That seems to be a good thing. Whereas if you brandished a knife to someone who is attacking you, it's probably not going to end up well for you. And so it's a very important point. It's hard to figure out a gun that is like, this is a crime gun and this is a self-defense gun. They're kind of the same thing.
Can you tell us what the Second Amendment says and what it doesn't say? And also, do you think that the Second Amendment applies to every type of gun, every category of gun?
So the Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the defense of a free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I might have missed some words there, but that's basically the gist of it. It was very controversial for a very long time, although not as controversial as some people might sort of point it out. First thing I want to say is that under our system of law, under our constitutional system, and under my, the one that I endorse too, if the Second Amendment did not exist, we would still have a right to self-defense, and we would still have a natural right to effective means of self-defense. It's like the First Amendment. The First Amendment does not give us our right to practice our religion or our right to speak our minds. It enshrines it in the Constitution. But those rights that we have are natural rights that are inherent in us by virtue of our humanity. And so this was exactly, for example, what the Ninth Amendment says of the Constitution. If a government tries to deprive you of your right to defend yourself, they might be depriving you of a natural right and therefore acting illegitimately, just like if they deprived you of your right to speak. But just like the First Amendment, if we analyze the Second Amendment, one of the very bad arguments you hear from the gun control crowd is that the Second Amendment was designed to protect muskets and things like this. That's no more true than that the First Amendment only protects ink quills, with parchment paper. The First Amendment protects those rights. It protects the natural right to self-expression, and therefore it entails that it protects the natural right to effective means of self-expression. Now that's not unlimited. Like you could say, oh yeah, we have you have the right to self-expression, but we've banned all paper, all pens, all typewriters, all internet, but you still have the right to self-expression. That's not how this works. Same with the Second Amendment, protects the natural right to self-defense, and you do not read into the Second Amendment whatever the status of guns was in 1791 when it was ratified. It protects effective means to self-defense that evolves with the times, which is why the words themselves don't kind of root it in history. Now, what does that do? Well, it's up for debate. I think that so just like the First Amendment, so let's say if you said I have a right to self-expression, and you decided to start a radio station and then turn it up to 300,000 watts and just like drown out all radio stations in the immediate like tri-state area, that would be a violation. That would be an overextension of your First Amendment rights, over jumping onto other people's rights. Similarly speaking, I think that you could say, what is a gun for an effective self-defense? Well, it's a gun that, that is commonly used by people for self-defense. Say guns that police officers have, right? Guns that police officers have that they're at least theoretically, their role is to not shoot people, but to protect people, to protect and serve. And they use guns like the Glock 17, and they use guns like the AR-15 to protect and serve other people, which entails that I would say that that's an effective means of self-defense for a citizen. Now, does that mean you can own a tank? Probably not. I would say no. First of all, if you read the words of the Second Amendment, it has the right to keep and bear arms, and you can't bear a tank. You can't carry it around unless you're like Hulk or something. Secondly, those kind of guns are kind of like the analogy I made to the radio station where, yeah, like if you had a tank and you said, hey, man, make my day, and you wanted to protect yourself with it, it would probably work. But also, if you had to use the tank, you would have a lot of collateral damage, right? And so a nuclear weapon might be, someone might not want to mess with you if you have a nuclear weapon, but if you actually use the thing, there's a lot of collateral damage. So we could talk about, the court is still exploring, or hopefully will be more exploring the limits of the Second Amendment. But, these sort of ideas that it's rooted in 1791 is preposterous. The idea that, if we look at what people use for use for self-defense, that's kind of what it generally protects. It probably doesn't protect rocket launchers and tanks, but, it could have an academic debate about it. But people don't really want rocket launchers so much. They want guns for self-defense, and they understand that they don't need a rocket launcher for that. We'll see in the future if we get, more cases on the Supreme Court that explain, what kind of guns are protected and what kind of guns aren't protected.
And using like a rocket launcher or a tank for hunting doesn't seem particularly useful either. I don't think it would be that effective.
Probably not, yeah.
So what is the homicide rate in the United States, and what is the rate of gun deaths?
Now we're getting into the good stuff. So I got into this stuff, Julia, at first. So I've been a libertarian since I was a teenager, but I wasn't really into guns, even though I kind of grew up in a pretty gun-friendly house to some extent. My brother hunts, my uncle hunts. My parents have had guns, but not a ton. And it wasn't my number one concern, but when I was in law school, I started doing work for a guy named David Kopel, who writes for the Vala Conspiracy. And he was one of the attorneys on the Heller case in 2008. And he probably knows more about guns than about anyone on the planet. And so I was doing research for him. And one of the reasons this issue really struck me, because one of the things that kind of drives a lot of what I do is when I just see a lot of misinformation and lies going on, it kind of goads me to get involved with debate. Because after I waded into the gun debate, I'm like, I'll be frank, like I couldn't believe how much misinformation and how many lies there were coming from the gun control side. And that's not true about all these areas. Like I think a lot of areas that I cover, I don't think that about the other side. And that's not every gun control advocate, but if you look at the general tenor of the debate, let me give you an example. You said gun deaths. If you look at any, say, Vox article, Vox has this article that it always shares whenever there's a mass shooting, or a bunch of these places, Mother Jones, some of the more left-wing places. They love to show this graph that says the more guns there are, the more gun deaths there are. And it's just a very simple graph. It just has, either the states with the guns and then kind of what the gun death rate is, or it has maybe international comparison and say, oh, this is very simple. And these people always tell you this is extremely simple. I think it's Herman Lopez at Vox says, there's no disputing this fact. Well, I'm sorry, this fact is heavily disputable and completely wrong. Well, I say, if you pull this up and you look at the gun deaths in America based on gun ownership, you will see that the hotbed of gun violence in this country is, well, where do you think it might be?
Well, I know.
Oh, so, no, you don't know. Where do you think it might be?
Well, it's from suicide, right?
Oh, yeah. No, I meant location.
Oh, location. City.
Well, you gave it away.
I don't know.
If you look at this, it'll say Wyoming and Alaska are the epicenters of gun violence in the United States. And this is because, as you pointed out, the real sleight of hand going on here, the real disingenuousness is the suicide factor. They say gun deaths, and by that they smuggle in suicides, which are 2/3 of deaths by gun in this country. And so when you look at Wyoming and Alaska, they have uniquely high suicide rates, and they have uniquely high gun ownership. So they just say, well, look at that. More guns mean more gun deaths. But again, this strikes me as extremely disingenuous because what people are interested in, suicide, and we need to talk more about that. But the policy questions about suicide by gun versus interpersonal gun violence versus murder by gun and other types of assault by gun are very, very different questions. What they know that people think that they're saying when they say America has the highest gun homicide rate or something like this, which it doesn't in the world, but it has this high gun homicide rate because it has high guns. And then they show you a graph that says gun deaths are correlated with more guns. And that graph is smuggling and suicides, which is why Wyoming and Alaska look like the epicenter of gun violence if you look at those graphs. If you actually take out the suicides and you say, all right, let's look on an international comparison. Let's look on a state-by-state comparison. Does having more guns equate to more interpersonal gun homicide, gun crime? The answer is unequivocally no. You can do this yourself. You can go find your data. If you have a little bit of R or Stata, you can run these correlations. You can see that, say, Germany has many more guns than, say, Ireland, but a much lower gun rate. If you do it you can do it with all over Europe. There's like no correlation at all between gun ownership and gun homicides, and the same within the United States. This is very upsetting to me because what we really need to be talking about when we talk about the problem with gun deaths. If someone says there are 40,000 gun deaths, this to me just strikes me as so disingenuous. 40,000 gun deaths in America last year, and then they say we need to ban assault weapons, and then you realize that 2/3 of those gun deaths were suicides of mostly men between 25 and 64, using pistols, and not using assault weapons. You're kind of looking at these people and you're saying, okay, look, most of this like pillar of gun deaths, these bodies, are suicides, and you're going after assault weapons. It's ludicrous. It's disingenuous because they just want the big number. They want to show you how many gun deaths there are in this country without understanding that it's mostly men between 25 and 64 killing themselves and inner city violence committed with pistols, often involving African Americans.
It's really crazy because, I mean, this is not a cute image to think about, but what I always think about is, I think like, okay, quote unquote, assault weapon. I think really long gun. Imagine someone trying to kill themselves with like a gun that's like 2 feet, 3 feet long. That's not,
it might happen occasionally, but it's not. It's pistols, and it's generally pistols. If you were going to do this sort of, I often use this experiment of like, I give you a magic button. I mean, the way you listen to the gun control graph, I give you a magic button, and that button will make some category of guns literally disappear. They will like just flash out of existence. Sometimes it seems like the depth of the thinking is, if you found out that last year half of the gun deaths were committed with black guns, and then I said, all right, Juliet, here's the button. Which guns do you want to eliminate? And then you push the button. You said, well, let's eliminate black guns. And so you push the button. All the black guns disappeared. I don't know how many that would be, a few 100 million probably, or 100 million. And then you said, well, look, we just saved 20,000 lives because we eliminated black guns. In the forthcoming year, we will have saved 20,000 lives. Well, that would be absolutely ludicrous to believe that. Because you wouldn't have people be like, well, I wasn't going to commit suicide or a crime because I don't have a black gun. Look at that brown gun over there. I mean, in some very real sense, we are oversaturated with guns for all the kind of mayhem that guns could be used for in the United States. You could, say we have 400 million guns. You could take away 200 million of those guns. We still have 200 million guns. And let's say all the black guns. You have 200 million brown guns. You have done literally nothing to affect the gun deaths and violence rate in the United States.
And I mean, especially if people are just killing themselves, like magazines are not going to do anything really. You only need like one.
Yeah. Magazine, all these things that we spend so much time talking about, magazine restrictions, 10-day waiting periods, that one has some possibility, but the evidence shows that people don't buy guns for suicide usually. We spend all of this time talking about assault weapons in schools. And of course, those tragic shootings, they hurt me every time, and I've had to wade into them. And we still have to look at the fact that overall, on average, maybe 10 to 15 children die in schools per year of guns. But 14 times that number goes home and kills themselves with a gun. And, we need to it's good to make schools safer and make sure there's some procedures in place, but we're not really focusing on the right stuff. If we're looking at these tragic occurrences, which are absolutely horrible, but like, that's a really good example. We should be asking a question when it comes to school shootings and public shootings, that why now? Like before 1968, you could have ordered an AR-15 through the mail with almost no restrictions whatsoever on purchasing that gun. The very first famous like kind of public school shooting was the Texas clock tower shooting in I think 65, where a guy went on top of a clock tower in the middle of the University of Texas campus and just started shooting people with a rifle. But at any time in those intervening periods, we had the Brady Bill come in 94, which does do background checks when you purchase a gun from a gun business. Any of that time in the 1970s, you could have bought an assault weapon. I'm putting that in quotes every time I say it, but bought an AR-15, let's say, and gone and shot up a school. It was always available. Why now? Like what's happening now? It's not because of gun saturation or gun or lack of gun control. We have more gun control now. Why is it happening now? That's the question we should be asking, and we should be focusing on how people are actually dying.
That's a good point. Honestly, it's really sad for me to even say this and realize this for the first time. I don't think anyone I know, or even myself, I've never asked that question. And I've never thought about it really, because that's just not the way that the debate is centered. That's not the way that the conversations about gun control and just guns in general are. That's not what they're focused around, which is kind of sad. And I don't know, we need to fix that, but that's a whole other story. Okay, so the current state of gun legislation, you say that we have more gun control than ever before, which is true, but also how would we, so first, what is the state of gun legislation right now in our country? But also, how would we reduce gun crimes and how would we reduce gun suicides? Because that seems to be the bigger problem, at least in terms of how many people are dying.
Yeah, so I've made an analogy on this before since I'm open immigration and a gun rights person that both these issues, immigration and gun, there's a lot of similarities in how the two political sides sort of treat the issue. I mean, obviously they're very core to the identity of, say, gun control is core to the identity, and gun rights are core to the identity of Democrats and Republicans, and same with immigration. But one of the analogies here is that I think today, especially after kind of the Trump years, that if you ask the average Republican or the average Fox News viewing Republican, what is the state of our borders today, they would probably say that we have something like open borders. You can hear this a lot on Fox News. Our current open border system, anyone can come into the country. This is like laughably wrong, but it's widely believed. And I think that similarly, if you ask someone who's a Democrat, one of these maybe gun discussed people, what do you think is the current state of our gun laws? I think that they generally believe that like there's almost no restrictions on guns. That like anyone, a 10-year-old can walk in and buy a machine gun, without any problem whatsoever. This is also laughably false. What happened since 1968 is we established, you have this inherent problem with guns, that what you're trying to do with guns, people who use guns, who like guns, they view them as a normal consumer good. And people who hate guns view them as something exceptional that probably should disappear from society. So you're trying to figure out how to get these people to work together. Starting in 1994, we came up with, as I said, a few minutes ago, there's an inherent problem here because there's so many guns, there's no registry. And if I say, hey, Juliet, you want to buy my gun, like when I get back to Virginia or something, like there's no way of tracking what that would be. I mean, you can't actually legal because you're not 18, but aside from that, aside from that, so I tell people this all the time, and it's the same with immigration. When I tell conservatives, like I show them how hard it is to come legally to this country. For example, if you have ever been convicted of a misdemeanor domestic violence offense, you can never own a gun legally for probably the rest of your life unless something changes in the law. Like a misdemeanor, you will commit a 10-year felony if you have ever even committed a misdemeanor domestic violence offense. And if you try to go to the gun store and buy this gun, if the background check system is working properly, which is a big if, but I won't get into that. And it does have your data in the system, and you say, hey, I want to buy that gun, and they run your background check, and it will flag and say, no, you cannot buy this gun because you have a misdemeanor domestic violence offense. That shocks a lot of people who are on the gun control side. There are many other, anyone who's ever been a felon, anyone who's ever been dishonorably discharged from the military, anyone who uses marijuana. This is a big problem. I'm here in Colorado, and it's a big problem, actually, because the form that you fill out to get a gun asked if you're a user of a controlled substance, which would include marijuana. And it's irrelevant that it's legal here. Everyone right now in Colorado who has a gun in their possession who is smoking marijuana is committing a federal felony of up to 10 years in prison. And if anyone decided to go after him, it would be almost impossible to avoid those charges. There was once a case, as an aside, to say how crazy this gets when they prosecute these people, which is, by the way, people of color get prosecuted for this stuff way more often than white people. There was a case where a guy who was a felon, and he knew that he was a felon, and he was a bartender at some bar. He went 2 blocks back to his house where his wife or his girlfriend was having an issue, and she held a gun to his head, and he took the gun away from her, and then immediately walked back to the bar and gave it to police officers who we knew were there. And he got charged with a 10-year felony for the 2 blocks that he walked with the gun because he possessed that gun as a felon. That's how extreme this can actually get. And although you could go, like, say you're a marijuana user or you have a domestic misdemeanor, domestic violence offense, the gun store that runs the background checks will, at least theoretically, if the system is working, prohibit you from buying a gun. You can go to someone and do what's called a private sale and say, hey, man, I want to buy your gun. If that person sells you that gun and knows that you have a domestic violence conviction, they're committing a crime. And then you just having that gun will be continually committing a crime. Now, it might be hard to find and you can hide it in your closet, but you will be continually committing a federal crime for having that gun. So in the face of that, and we won't even get into other gun rules about, importation and manufacture and gunsmithing, but in the face of that, the guns are the most heavily regulated consumer product in America by far. In the face of all that, it's kind of hard to say, well, what is the state of gun law in America? It's pretty harsh, to be honest, especially when they come in and they say, we're just going to pass more penalties. And so more penalties will just be put on people, where suddenly you might become a felon because the gun that you currently own, this actually kind of possibly could have happened to me when they were debating some gun legislation in Virginia. So I own a gun called an M1 carbine, which was used in World War II. It's like a paratrooper gun, and it has a bayonet mount on it. So it means that back in the war, actually they were put on after the war, but you could put a knife on the end of it. Well, they were debating partially a bill that would say that any gun with a bayonet mount was now a prohibited gun. Any semi-automatic rifle with a bayonet mount was a prohibited gun. And so I'm sitting here looking at this 70-year-old gun and thinking, if they pass this law, I will, like, almost instantaneously, except for some safe harbor, become a felon for just having this 70-year-old gun that has a bayonet mount. And I don't know about you, but I haven't heard about any mass bayonettings recently. No. But that's the kind of thing that we have to think about when we're just talking about putting more penalties and stuff on these guns. And again, going back to our thing, not addressing the actual problem, which is suicide and inner city gun violence. And so you ask this question of how do you do this? Well, for me, my biggest thing, because I deeply care about these gun deaths, is asking, why are people doing this? Similar with the mass shooters, why do people commit crimes? And what we've seen, for example, in America since like 1992, we've seen the violent crime rate in this country fall roughly in half. It went up this last year. We'll see some, I think, pretty bad data after we see this year. But we've seen it roughly fall in half. The world, when I was born in the 80s, it was extremely dangerous. New York City was extremely dangerous in the 80s. There was very real fear that, like, the world was going to dive into a pit of chaos. So you can think of movies like Escape from New York, or all these movies where the crime was going to be so bad that it would be almost impossible to live your normal life. Well, it just started falling, and there's a whole thing about why in the early 90s. And at the same time, the level of guns had probably doubled in that time. So if you look at just a basic graph, guns have gone way up, crime has gone way down. Some types of crime, like school shootings, are happening. But like I think if you're asking about how do you fix this sort of interpersonal gun violence problem, the first question you should ask yourself is, why would guns cause crime? And it's funny, this question doesn't get asked enough either. So Julia, I don't know if you have, so because people say guns cause crime, right? So someone who says guns cause crime, you know, what conditions would make a gun like actually cause a crime?
Well, the gun isn't like it's not like the genie bottle from Aladdin. It's not like come, let the
Yeah.
genie out and grant you. Like it's not talking to
Exactly.
you. It can't do anything. So
But
so I don't.
there is an answer. I say this to conservatives all the time. I say guns can cause crime. And the way that they can cause crime, and I mean bring into existence a crime that previously wouldn't have existed but for the gun, is for the same reason I mentioned previous. There's someone out there who is too scared to rob a 7-Eleven with a knife. And if you gave him a gun, he suddenly would be like, oh, I can do this. Like, because it projects force over a distance, I can now rob this 7-Eleven. That's one way that guns can cause crime. Now, the next question is how much of crime is like that? How much of crime is like right where the criminal is like right on the margins where they're like, I might commit a crime, might not commit a crime. And then they get a gun and they're like, ooh, definitely going to commit a crime now. It exists, but I don't think it's very common. And the data shows it's not very common either. So that's the first question we're talking about. So we need to focus on why people are using guns to commit crime. Not saying that the guns cause them to commit crime. And so if we're talking about lowering those questions, well, first of all, it is going down, and I think it will continue to go down, except for these sort of blip years. But the second question is things like the drug war. So I've said this, going back to our last episode, there is not a gun control policy you could reasonably pass that would do more to mitigate interpersonal gun violence than ending the drug war. And the thing that most frustrates me is, people say the gun rights people are obsessed with guns. That says like, okay, why are you so obsessed with guns? The people are really obsessed with guns are the gun control people, that they see any problem like a school shooter or inner city gun violence, and they decide to go after the tool as opposed to the underlying causes, that the tool is the reason this is happening. And that to me is it's just the wrong approach. And it's a waste of legislative energy to go in and try and spend all of this political capital to say, try and ban assault weapons. And then by your own admission, maybe if no one ever substitutes another gun, save 150 people's lives versus actually doing something to work on these issues. And suicide is a similar way. I mean, suicide is that one's deeply concerning for me. And it's a very difficult thing to try and figure out because what you're seeing, suicides are often impulsive decisions and the gun makes that easier. Alcohol and drugs are often involved. And a lot of, people who try to commit suicide, a huge amount of them who survive later regret the decision. And, all these tragic suicides out there where someone just decided to do it all of a sudden. And then you wonder, that the gun, that's the thing that really gets me and something we had to go for. And it's very difficult because you don't want to take guns away from depressed people in some sort of legal, like cops coming or doctors reporting them, because then depressed people might not go to their doctors and get help for their depression because they don't want their guns to be taken away. So you got to try and reach out to those people and say, hey, like, here's the data, if you're feeling really depressed, you want to just give your guns, to your brother for like a couple months and it might make you feel better. But it's a very, very vexing problem, but we should be focusing on that and the inner city violence problem.
So, okay, now let's go into the arguments because you mentioned some from the right and you have mentioned some from the left. And this is kind of what I've been thinking about. And you also mentioned that you care about the people that die from gun violence, which is true. I feel like no one doesn't care about people who die generally, and especially from gun violence. That just does not seem like the way to go. So what do you say to people who ask you why you don't care about those people and why you want guns to be all like legal and stuff?
Well, I mean, generally, if a person is attacking me like that, I've learned enough in my professional career to kind of not engage in some sense that it's not really worth it. But it's important, I think, in any public policy debate that if you do believe your opponent's heart is the right place, that's where you should start whatever debate you're having. Secondly, I understand where the gun control people are coming from. I really do. Like, I often begin one of my, when I give a speech on this issue, I start by asking, who in this crowd is disgusted by guns, as I mentioned. I'll get some hands, and I'll say, okay, next is who in this crowd thinks that a civilized society would be one in which like guns were not available to private hands, basically. And I get hands for that too. That's kind of like the Star Trek universe, where we've advanced beyond guns kind of idea. And I sympathize with both of those. But the gun discussed, I said, is a really bad position. I advise anyone who is gun control, who really wants to even be a better advocate for gun control. And if you've never shot a gun, go shoot a gun. I mean, just go shoot a gun. Have someone show you the basic functionality of it. And if you still want to do gun control, that's fine. But like, at least you'll be coming from a better position. I have taken a lot of people shooting for the first time, and sometimes they're gun control people and they'll say, wow, I'm kind of upset by how fun this is, which I understand, but you can't really, it's like swimming pools kill, a lot of kids by accidents per year. Swimming pools are fun and dangerous. And if someone was like, we need to ban swimming pools because of all these kids that had died, and then you ask them, well, have you ever been swimming? It's like, why would anyone need to own a swimming pool when it's so dangerous? And like, have you ever been swimming? It's like, no. It's like, well, you don't know what the heck you're talking about. Like, swimming is fun. That's one reason, right? And the way people have guns, that's the way they think about it. So, first thing is, don't be disgusted by guns. Like, even to be a better gun control officer, like, go shooting, try and figure out how they work. And then the second thing is, this is the bottom line on some level. We are not getting rid of guns in America. It's not going to happen. We're not going to live in the Star Trek universe. We're not going to be like Japan, where you have to go through massive, massive amounts of background checks. It's not going to happen. Let's say there's 400 million guns, 300 million guns, right? Let's say that after the next tragic shooting, there is a massive upswell of civic responsibility, and 90% of guns are turned in to be destroyed. Like 90% of guns in America, which would be just incredible. I mean, completely unrealistic. That leaves 40 million guns in America. And guess who will hold on to their guns? First, the ones who don't have a good sense of civic responsibility, possibly criminals. And would this be a good situation? And so when you ask me, I just want the conversation to be meaningful. And I don't want to be based on disgust, unrealistic expectations. I want to be based on the right victims, the people we should be focusing on, not just the guns, the causes of the gun violence. All this is like what I ask. So if you're accusing me of not caring, I just say, well, either A, I'm not going to talk to you, but like, listen to what I'm saying here. Like, if we both can get on the same page, we can do something together about some the things that actually are a problem. But if you just sit around and call everyone who owns a gun a psychopath, or nascent psychopath, and attack, say, the size of their manhood, which is a very common thing, that guns are some sort of substitute for the size of your manhood, all these kind of things, this is not how to do this debate. If you want to do effective gun policy that can save lives without going after red herrings, then you need to learn about guns, and you need to stop thinking that anyone who owns a gun is some sort of Philistine.
That is good. I mean, I think that is where the main problems are coming from, is just people not understanding how to have this conversation on both sides, and not understanding guns, and not even being willing to like listen or try. I've talked to some of my friends about it, and some of them are willing to try it, like when we're the right age and everything, but some of them don't even want to because of the disgust. And it's just really interesting to see, but it also kind of makes me sad, because I'm like, how will you ever, I feel like it kind of takes away your credibility in talking about it, because yeah, you can feel bad, but also if you don't even try to understand how the rest of America who's not shooting people every single day feel, how is that going to work? I don't know. But
Yeah.
Okay, let us wrap this up, because I feel like we could talk for like 10 more years about this.
Yes.
So, what is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Well, okay. I mean, I thought of a bunch of these when we sent the question along. So, I mean, I probably, suspected that more guns did mean more crime. It's on the topic, but on a broader thing, there's a lot of things that I used to believe. when I was a teenager, I was pretty militantly atheist, like anti-theist kind of, and believing that religion was like a force of evil in the world. And I no longer believe that. I think there are many bad things about some religions, but I think that religion can be a very good force in society for people. I used to believe on a more policy level, I used to believe before I took a class in law school that it was probably true, and this can be the next episode we do, that it was probably true that money in politics and donations and campaign spending was a problem, and that we needed, if we were going to fix government, we needed to clamp down on money in politics. And I no longer believe that. Absolutely do not believe that. Those are the two that popped in my head. But I think, just in general, you should always be trying to challenge your beliefs, no matter how mundane even they are. I'm a huge music person, as you are, as you know. I used to believe that Neil Diamond was like the worst music ever made, and then one day I like listened to an early album because I was going to give him another shot, and I was like, this is actually quite good. I used to hate a lot of music that I love. I used to hate. Because it was so weird and challenging to me, and I would try and figure out what people saw in this, and suddenly it would click. And I think that that's a very rewarding thing. So generally speaking, your aesthetic judgments, your ideas that you're quite sure of. I got to the point that when I feel more sure about something, that it would require a crazy person to disagree with me, even though 50% of the people might disagree with me, then I interrogate my views even more and say, okay, there's so many biases that we buy into. Am I just doing confirmation bias? Am I doing all these biases to just convince myself I'm correct? Because there's a lot of people who disagree with you. And one of the more valuable things that you can think about, if you do look at the world and you say, look, 50% of people can fundamentally disagree on, say, gun control, right? And you could say, well, why do they disagree? And it could be like, oh, because they're duped or they're tough. And we've talked about some of these issues that they may not understand. But one of the reasons that they disagree is because you're not as convincing as you think you are. And there are fundamentally contentious issues at play here. And even though you might be 1000% sure, there are other people who are 1000% sure on the other side. And maybe you can get together and actually chat about those differences and interrogate your beliefs and wonder why people disagree with you. Because you have a lot of those beliefs in your head, as do I, that are not as convincing as you think they are.
That is a good thing that I think. Wait, can you hear me? Hold on. Okay. LOL. Starting over. That's a really good thing to hear, and I think a lot of people need to remind themselves of that. I have a sticky note on my door that says, how do you know that what you believe is right? And I look at it when I wake up every morning, and I'm like, how do I know? And then every day, throughout the day, everything that anyone says, I'm like, how do I know? How do they know? And I don't know, it's kind of this reflection I go through every day. And it's interesting because I've also been able to watch myself evolve in how I go about conversations with other people about differing beliefs and how I assess what I believe. And so, I don't know, it's really interesting. Thank you so much, Trevor. This has been so informative and also so interesting. I love talking about this sort of stuff. I mean, it is heavy, but it's really important and it's also really relevant. So yeah, thank you so much. And
always a pleasure.
yeah. Okay. Thank you.